Hello everyone, hello Jason Isaacs, hello people who are interested in why the government always wins. This has been a long time coming. So this is essentially a video on two ideas that I talk about an awful lot, but I think I've ever taken the time properly to explain. And I should, at the top, explain that these are Floydisms. So if you are going to use them in your work, then you probably better make sure that you explain them fully and don't just park them there and expect that everyone's going to know what you're talking about. So anyway, the two ideas we're going to talk about today are the compliant majority and the institutional imbalance. The chances of me getting through both of these in 15 minutes seems very, very slim indeed. So what we'll probably do is we'll push on with the compliant majority, and if I need to go into a second video to deal with the institutional imbalance, then so be it. But the central idea here, the central conceit, is this big issue, which is why the government always wins. Now, unfortunately, I've chosen to use the house always wins because I'm thinking about casinos here. If you're interested, these are the odds that you're going to get if you go into a casino. And I do urge that you watch this video here, which is The Eye in the Sky Sees All, a fantastic bit of a really, really good video. But it is slightly misleading in that we're not talking about the House always winning. In fact, what we're really thinking about is the House of Commons always seems to lose. Whenever it comes down to a straight fight between the government and the House of Commons in particular, the odds seem to be stacked in favour of the government. And what we're going to try to do today is to explain exactly why that is the case. So, why does the government almost always win? And those two ideas, again, those Floydisms, the compliant majority and institutional imbalance. In overview, the compliant majority is comprised of two things. First of all, it's the electoral system, which always returns, or generally can be expected to return, a majority to one party or another. That party gets to form a government, and then that majority is ruthlessly disciplined. We have a very, very strong system of party obedience. And what that means is that the House is unlikely, the House of Commons is unlikely to defy the government in any matter, in any vote that really, really matters. So whenever something comes into the House of Commons, we know if the government really wants it to move in one direction or another, that generally speaking, the government will always get its will because it has the majority of MPs there, and those MPs do as they're told. The institutional imbalance, on the other hand, seems to indicate that the government is able to manipulate any given situation to their advantage. The government, as we know, has control of the parliamentary timetable. The royal prerogative is very difficult for the government, is very difficult for the House to police in isolation. There are the limits that exist to the effectiveness of parliamentary checking of government, and of course the Parliament Acts allow for the government to completely ignore one half of Parliament if it chooses to do so. Now, I'm going to go into each of those in more detail. And as I said, the second half of this, the institutional imbalance, is probably going to take a video all of its own, but we'll worry about that when we get to it. Let's start off then with the compliant majority. And as I said earlier, the compliant majority is comprised, or really comes about, as a consequence of two distinct ideas. One of those is the electoral process. And you will know all of this already. But most of the time, in fact, with three exceptions, the government has been returned, or rather a party has been returned with a comfortable majority in the House of Commons. Again, make the distinction there between a majority and the plurality. The current Conservative administration has a plurality in that nobody has more seats than it, but they do not have more than 50% of the seats. So that's what we call a majority in the parliamentary sense. You might choose to call it an overall majority in the normal day use of the phrase. But yeah, the difference there between the majority and the plurality is going to help you tremendously. However, arguably, the size of the majority is far less important than the fact that it is ruthlessly disciplined. The party members very rarely disobey party instructions. Every MP knows that fundamentally the reason they are in the House of Commons is not because of their personal qualities, or rather, it may be about their personal qualities second, but it owes an awful lot more to the fact that they represent one or the other of the two major parties, and in some instances, a regional party. So MPs generally are there on the strength of their party allegiance rather than their personal qualities. And if you really want to dig into that in any great detail, I suggest you go and have a look at the parliamentary career, the electoral career of Shaun Woodward, who crossed the floor in 2001. If I remember correctly. So have a look at Shaun Woodward, look at his party history, and you'll see how somebody went from being a very, very secure MP because they represented a very, very safe Conservative seat, Witney, to becoming a very, very secure Labour MP because they represented a very, very safe Labour constituency. In the case of Woodward, that would be St Helens South. So he went from Witney to St Helens South with healthy majorities in both. But again, you can look into that in your own time. The key point here is that every MP knows that they owe their political career first to their party. And only second, perhaps, if at all that, to their own personal qualities. So as a consequence of that, we don't have many independent candidates. And the job prospects, that is promotion to a higher office, those will be controlled by your party managers. That is part of the discipline process. And everybody, of course, wants to be off the back benches. And, if necessary, then maybe we'll employ other measures that I can't really go into on the record. But the critical thing here is that we have two elements that give the government control of the House of Commons. The electoral system will tend to give them a healthy majority, and the majority then becomes ruthlessly disciplined by virtue of the party's internal structures and an internal discipline factory, for want of a better word. Good. So that's the compliant majority. So as I said earlier, the majority plus compliance gives you the electoral compliant. The majority plus the compliance gives you the compliant majority. That is the electoral system and party discipline working in tandem. And don't forget that even if they are a minority, your House of Commons opposition will generally be a compliant minority in that they will follow the instructions that come to them from their party leaders. And of course, at this point, you should be way ahead of me going, yes, but Brexit has broken everything. And I couldn't agree more. And we will get to that when the time comes. But basically, the electoral system has failed to deliver a majority. That was certainly the case in 2017. Whenever I remember correctly, the Conservatives came up eight seats short. Actually, no, 12 seats short, if I remember correctly. But they were able to cobble together a sort of marriage of convenience with the DUP. But more importantly, the internal systems of discipline and organisation have broken down as Brexit has cut across party divisions. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just talk about the compliant majority. So where do we see the compliant majority in effect? And basically that is in anywhere where we see a substantive vote, anywhere where we see a vote that actually matters. So in the legislative process, that'll be in any significant reading, and of course in the public bill itself. The public bill committees probably shouldn't be whipped, but we know that they are. And of course the government has a majority in a public bill committee because, just as all of the committees, the membership of that committee will mirror or reflect the general makeup of the House. So the government gets a majority on its committees. And again, in substantive divisions and confidence motions and other whipped votes, perhaps most significantly the votes on military action. And in questions, you're always going to be able to rely on softballs from your own team. And if you've got a majority of those, then you're going to get a healthy number of softball questions to answer. So there we see the compliant majority in the legislative process, in your substantive divisions and elsewhere. Interestingly, you don't see it in these areas. Select committees, again, they have a majority. The government will have a majority. The membership of your select committee will mirror the wider House. But the whips feel not inclined to get involved there. And if you know your stuff, you'll know that's because your select committee can only advise. It can never compel the government to act. And so very much these are allowed to get on with it and do some very, very good work that the government might later choose to incorporate into its legislation. I urge you to look at the work in Breaking the Cycle, and that was released in 2013 by the Home Office by the Departmental Select Committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee. They released Breaking the Cycle in 2013, and then 3 years later the government introduced legislation on legal highs, more or less as a direct response to that report. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself again, or rather I'm getting dragged out of line. We don't see a compliant majority in the House of Lords, first of all, because there is no majority in the House of Lords, or rather certainly no absolute majority for either party, certainly after the House of Lords reform in 1999. And we have vastly reduced discipline because, of course, not many people in the House of Lords are interested in fighting elections. And equally, not many of them are necessarily interested in higher office. Either they've done that already by virtue of being in the House of Commons and being a retired politician, or indeed they're figures of industry who are not massively interested in running a small government department when they've run a multi-million-dollar company. Anyway, there is no compliant majority in the House of Lords. And what I'm going to do is, I'm at 10 minutes there, so I'm going to stop at that point. We will come back to this, and I look forward to doing so. So I'm going to upload this, and I'll see you all again in a few minutes for the next half of the presentation. So, thank you very much, and see you in a second. Bye.